Every year, a stranger transferred $88,888 to me on my birthday. This went on for 15 years, and I never knew who the sender was. But this year, instead of the usual transfer, $32 million arrived with one phrase: "We need to meet urgently." Good day, dear listeners. It is Diana again. I am glad you are here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city and what time you are listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Athena, and the fortune that landed in my lap was not a gift. It was a trap. I live in Boston, a city that deeply respects history and unshakable roots. As an ecological landscape architect, my entire professional life is dedicated to understanding the earth. I study the composition of soil. I study natural foundations. I focus my energy on what sustains life long after the shiny, artificial structures built above it begin to weather, fracture, and collapse. It is a quiet, deliberate profession that requires patience and a willingness to look beneath the surface. It is also the exact philosophical opposite of the towering empire my biological family built. For the past 15 years, I have raised my 10-year-old daughter, Ellie, entirely on my own. I have also managed the complex medical care of my mother, Bella. Bella was once a brilliant, world-renowned botanist, a woman who could identify any coastal plant by simply touching its leaves in the dark. Now, she resides in an assisted living facility just outside the city borders. The early, creeping stages of Alzheimer's disease have slowly begun to erase the sharp, beautiful edges of her mind. And then, there was the money. $88,888. Every single year, like clockwork, on the exact morning of my birthday. The transfers always came from a blinded corporate routing number. There was no name attached. There was no greeting card sent in the mail. Just a sterile, automated bank notification flashing on my screen. I never touched a single cent of it. Whenever that notification appeared, I simply moved the funds into an isolated, high-yield savings account and threw away the metaphorical key. I lived completely off my own independent design contracts. I paid for Ellie's schooling and Bella's specialized medical care through my own hard work. Something deep within my gut, a primal instinct I refused to ignore, always warned me that the money was tainted. You do not get an allowance of nearly $90,000 from a ghost without heavy, invisible strings attached. I always strongly suspected the ghost was Gregory. Gregory was the CEO of a massive coastal real estate development conglomerate, a ruthless businessman who happened to be my biological uncle. But I refused to call him family. Gregory traded in concrete, aggressively pushing luxury resorts onto fragile East Coast shorelines. He was a man who believed every living thing and every person had a clear price tag. Before Bella's memory started to truly fragment, she used to sit by the large window in her room, staring out at the harbor, and whisper things I did not understand at the time. She would grip my wrist with surprising strength and tell me to beware of the concrete. I always assumed she was just lamenting the loss of nature, expressing her ecological grief over Gregory paving over the beaches she loved so much. I did not realize she was leaving me a map. The arrival of $32 million fundamentally changed the equation. A number that massive does not arrive by clerical error. It arrives because someone is desperate. It arrives because someone is terrified of losing something much bigger. And a man like Gregory only pays that kind of money up front when he is trying to quietly buy something worth 10 times more. I stared at the notification on my phone. I did not panic. When you see $32 million suddenly materialize in your checking account, the world is supposed to stop turning. You are supposed to scream, drop your coffee mug, or immediately call the fraud department in a state of sheer, unadulterated hysteria. I did absolutely none of those things. I carefully set my phone face down on my drafting table. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the steady rhythm of the autumn rain against my office window ground my thoughts. I am a landscape architect. When a sudden, violent flood threatens a carefully designed terrain, you do not scream at the rushing water. You step back. You analyze the drainage systems. You find the exact source of the overwhelming pressure. The message attached to the massive wire transfer consisted of exactly 5 words. We need to meet urgently. It did not say please. It did not offer polite congratulations. It was a strict command cleverly disguised as a financial deposit. Gregory was a man who communicated entirely through the language of leverage. He sincerely believed that dropping a small fortune into my lap would instantly paralyze me with profound gratitude or blind me with sudden greed. He assumed I would instantly comply, rush to his office, sign whatever non-disclosure agreement he slid across his polished mahogany desk, and walk away quietly. He miscalculated entirely. If someone throws $32 million at you without a contract already signed and filed in place, it means they are operating on borrowed time. They are dangerously exposed. That massive sum of money was not a display of his unyielding power. It was a glaring, desperate beacon of his current vulnerability. I opened my laptop and deliberately bypassed my standard banking applications. Instead, I pulled up a highly secure, encrypted messaging service. I needed someone who fluently understood the dark language of hidden money. I needed someone who could see the invisible threads connecting offshore holding accounts to massive real estate empires. I called Kieran. Kieran was a retired forensic accountant, decades ago. He had been the brilliant financial conscience of the family business, back before Gregory fully consumed and corrupted it. Kieran was a quiet, meticulous man who lived alone with his golden retriever and trusted complex spreadsheets far more than he ever trusted human beings. He had always maintained a soft, protective spot for Bella, silently disapproving of how she had been ruthlessly sidelined after my father's death. He answered the call on the second ring. "Athena." Kieran's gravelly voice came through the speaker. "You only call on a Tuesday morning if the soil is rapidly shifting?" "The ground is splitting wide open. Kieran," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. I concisely explained the 15 years of bizarre, unprompted deposits. I gave him the exact recurring figure of $88,888. Then, I calmly told him about the $32 million that had just cleared into my account an hour ago. Heavy silence hung on the line for a long moment. I could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard in the background. "Do not touch a single cent of that new transfer," Kieran finally stated, his tone turning deadly serious. "Do not reply to the message. Do not acknowledge receipt of the funds." "I haven't," I assured him. "I need you to thoroughly trace the origin. I need to know exactly what he is trying to buy from me before the clock runs out." "I will start digging immediately," Kieran promised. I hung up the phone. The game had begun. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the assisted living facility. The coastal Massachusetts air was sharp and intensely salty, a very familiar scent that usually brought me a deep sense of comfort. Today, however, the heavy breeze felt remarkably like a warning. Bella's room was positioned on the second floor, offering a wide, uninterrupted view of the turbulent Atlantic Ocean. When I walked in, she was sitting rigidly in her favorite floral armchair. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and she wore a soft lavender cardigan. On some challenging days, she was completely lost in the thick fog of her illness. On other, rarer days, the fog parted completely, revealing the brilliant, perceptive scientist who had taught me the Latin names of every native fern in New England. Today, the thick fog was hovering closely. The television securely mounted on the wall was playing a local financial news channel on low volume. I pulled up a chair and sat beside her, gently taking her hand in mine. Her skin was incredibly thin, feeling almost like delicate, translucent parchment. "Hi, Bella," I said softly. I generally refused to call her mom in these highly disorienting moments, Using her given name sometimes helped comfortably anchor her back to the present reality. She turned her head to me, offering a vague, exquisitely polite smile. "The blue hydrangeas need significantly more acidic soil," she murmured, completely disconnected from the actual room we were sitting in. "I will take care of them," I promised gently. I casually glanced up at the television screen. The impeccably dressed news anchor was breathlessly discussing a massive upcoming corporate merger. The bright graphic on the screen displayed the recognizable logo of Gregory's coastal real estate conglomerate sitting directly alongside a prestigious multinational hotel brand. The scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen read in bold letters, "Landmark acquisition paves way for complete East Coast monopoly." Suddenly, Bella's grip on my hand tightened. It was a sharp, fiercely urgent squeeze that genuinely startled me. I immediately looked down at her. Her eyes, which had been deeply clouded just a moment before, were now piercingly clear and violently focused. She was staring directly at the television screen, her jaw firmly set in a rigid line of pure defiance that I had not witnessed in a decade. "Bella?" I asked cautiously. She leaned in close to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, intensely lucid whisper. It was exactly as if the powerful woman she used to be had forcefully clawed her way back to the surface for just a few precious seconds. "Do not look at the luxury hotels, Athena," she whispered, her unblinking gaze permanently fixed on Gregory's smiling, arrogant face on the live broadcast. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart slowly accelerating in my chest. "The tall hotels are just fragile glass and human vanity," she continued, her breathing becoming slightly elevated. "He builds the shiny glass, but he absolutely does not own what holds them up." She turned her head slowly, looking me dead in the eye. The sheer intensity of her stare sent a freezing shockwave directly through my chest. "Look down, Athena. Look carefully at the dirt. Look deeply at the sand. Look down at the ground." She squeezed my hand one last, powerful time. "The ground is mine." And exactly just like that, the profound clarity vanished. The sharp, intelligent light in her eyes dissolved rapidly back into the familiar, hazy confusion of the disease. She let go of my hand, relaxed her posture, and looked peacefully out the window at the circling seagulls. "The blue hydrangeas," she muttered quietly again. I sat frozen. I finally understood her. For a long time after that intense visit, I sat silently in my car in the parking lot of the care facility, just listening to the rhythmic, mechanical beat of the windshield wipers. "The ground is mine." Bella's lucid words echoed relentlessly in the confined space of the vehicle. To truly understand why those 4 words were so fundamentally revolutionary, you have to clearly understand the dark architecture of emotional imprisonment. Clinical psychologists call this specific phenomenon learned helplessness. It happens when an animal, or a human being, is subjected to prolonged, completely inescapable psychological stress. Over an extended period of time, you simply stop trying to jump over the fence. You actively convince yourself that the oppressive cage is actually a protective shield, and you delude yourself into believing that your captor is your benevolent protector. That was precisely what Gregory had meticulously done to us. When my father passed away unexpectedly, I was just a vulnerable teenager. Bella, who was deeply grieving and naturally averse to the ruthless, cutthroat world of corporate finance, was incredibly exposed. Gregory instantly swooped in under the brilliant disguise of the grieving, immensely supportive brother-in-law. He aggressively took over the management of the family's vast assets, forcefully insisting that he was heroically saving us from the overwhelming, crushing burden of wealth. He carefully framed every single aggressive corporate maneuver as a noble, personal sacrifice he was willingly making for our peace of mind. He told Bella that the real estate market was far too vicious for a gentle, academic botanist. He told me that I needed to focus entirely on my education, not on complicated balance sheets. He made his absolute dictatorial control look exactly like an act of profound familial love. It was a brilliantly executed, sociopathic illusion. We were systematically pushed to the absolute margins of our own family's legacy. When the annual, precise deposits of $88,888 began appearing in my account, I did not dare question them. I fully absorbed the carefully crafted narrative that Gregory was generously providing for his late brother's family out of the pure goodness of his heart. I swallowed the quiet, daily indignity of being treated like a pathetic charity case because fighting back against a billionaire felt mathematically impossible. The money was never a loving gift. It was a perfectly measured, calculated dose of compliance. It was exactly just enough to keep us physically comfortable, but delivered in a highly specific way that constantly reminded us of our pathetic dependency. It was a heavy, invisible chain, custom designed to ensure I would never dare to look past the shiny surface of his supposed generosity. Gregory arrogantly relied on my continued silence. He banked millions on my presumed gratitude. He built a towering, $500 million empire, assuming that the quiet girl obsessed with planting trees would never have the audacity to critically examine the hidden foundation of his wealth. But psychological trauma permanently changes you. It either breaks you down entirely, or it slowly hardens you into something remarkably unbreakable. I had spent 15 years quietly building my own successful life, entirely independent of his toxic, financial ecosystem. I had thoroughly learned how to survive outside of his gilded cage. Now, with $32 million suspiciously dangling in front of me, and my mother's cryptic, powerful warning ringing loudly in my ears, the invisible chain finally snapped. Gregory arrogantly thought he was negotiating with the scared, marginalized teenager he had easily manipulated decades ago. He was drastically wrong. The cage was gone. For the first few years after my father died and Gregory meticulously orchestrated his silent takeover of our lives, I genuinely believed I was the weak one. I believed my mother and I were fragile liabilities, exactly as he had so generously painted us. But as I grew older, I slowly began to realize that true strength does not look like loud, arrogant domination. True strength looks like a deep, unshakable root system. I deliberately chose a path that completely severed me from his world of aggressive coastal real estate. I became an ecological landscape architect. My entire career was built on reversing the exact kind of environmental damage that men like Gregory caused. He built towering luxury resorts by pouring thousands of tons of concrete over fragile wetlands, destroying natural barriers for the sake of an unobstructed ocean view. I spent my days analyzing soil degradation, designing natural coastal defenses, and planting native seagrass to stop severe erosion. He dealt in temporary, shiny illusions. I dealt in permanent, living foundations. I built a modest but highly respected firm completely on my own. I did not use a single dime of his annual $88,000 transfers to fund my education or my business. I lived in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in Boston. I raised Ellie to deeply respect the earth, teaching her the intricate names of coastal birds and the silent intelligence of old-growth trees. She grew up completely unaware of the massive, toxic wealth that supposedly shadowed our family name. I was perfectly content being the forgotten, eccentric niece. I actively welcomed the profound silence from Gregory's side of the family. I convinced myself that walking away from the empire was the ultimate victory. I thought that by refusing to participate in his ruthlessly greedy ecosystem, I had cleanly escaped his control. I had proudly built my own independent life, brick by brick, plant by plant. But I was fundamentally naive. I had spent my entire adult life studying the ground, meticulously analyzing how Earth supports life. Yet, I had never once bothered to look at the legal ownership of the specific ground my own family was standing on. I had graciously allowed Gregory to manage the abstract, boring paperwork of the past, assuming it had absolutely nothing to do with my carefully curated present. I did not realize that true freedom requires more than just walking away. Sometimes, true freedom requires turning back around and meticulously dismantling the very cage that originally held you. I had built a beautiful, independent life, but I was about to discover that Gregory's towering $500 million empire was silently constructed directly over my mother's stolen territory. The illusion of my peaceful separation was about to violently shatter. Gregory did not possess the patience to simply wait for a phone call. 2 days after the $32 million silently appeared in my isolated account, the heavy glass door of my small design studio swung open. He looked entirely out of place standing in my workspace. My office smelled of damp earth, dried botanical samples, and strong black tea. Gregory smelled of expensive, aggressive cologne and tailored Italian wool. He offered me a bright, practiced smile that did not even remotely reach his cold, calculating eyes. He walked gracefully past my drafting tables and casually dropped a thick, professionally bound leather folder directly onto my desk. "Athena, you look remarkably well," he said, his voice entirely too loud for the quiet room. "I assume you saw the transfer. I wanted to personally ensure everything went smoothly." I did not stand up. I simply looked at the leather folder and then back up at him. A wire transfer of that magnitude usually requires a conversation first. "Gregory, not after—" He waved his hand dismissively, the heavy gold watch on his wrist catching the overhead light. "It is simply an early distribution of the family estate. I have been restructuring the corporate holding companies, and I wanted to make absolutely certain that you, Ellie, and poor Bella were permanently secured. You have always been so fiercely independent, but there is no need to struggle anymore." He tapped his manicured index finger against the heavy folder. "This is just a standard family release form, a basic formality to satisfy the corporate lawyers regarding the distribution of the $32 million. It legally finalizes the separation of your branch of the family from the corporate liabilities. Sign it, and you will never have to worry about a single financial matter ever again." I stared at him. He was playing the benevolent, caring uncle flawlessly, but I was no longer a frightened, grieving teenager. I could clearly see the microscopic tension tight around his jawline. I could see the way his eyes tracked my hands, practically begging me to reach for a pen. He was not offering me a gift. He was desperately trying to buy a fire door. 50 pages is quite lengthy for a standard family formality," I noted calmly, not making a single move to open the document. "I will have my attorney review the fine print before I acknowledge any receipt of those funds." The charming mask slipped, just for a fraction of a millisecond. A sharp flash of genuine irritation crossed his face before he expertly smoothed it over. "There is really no need to unnecessarily complicate this with outside lawyers. Athena, time is of the essence with these specific tax structures." "Then the tax structures will simply have to wait," I replied, my voice dropping to a perfectly flat, unyielding tone. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, finally realizing that the quiet girl he thought he knew was no longer sitting at the desk. He turned and walked out, leaving the folder behind like a ticking bomb. The true reason for Gregory's sudden, uncharacteristic urgency did not remain a secret for long. The very next morning, the financial world politely explained exactly why my uncle was perfectly willing to part with $32 million on a random Tuesday. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, opening the digital front page of the Wall Street Journal. There, dominating the top headlines, was a highly flattering photograph of Gregory standing in front of his flagship coastal resort. The bold headline beneath it read, "Regional Real Estate Titan Enters Final Due Diligence for Landmark Multinational Merger." I read the article twice, absorbing the incredibly precise corporate terminology. Gregory's privately held conglomerate was in the absolute final stages of a massive, $500 million acquisition by a prominent global hotel group. In the high-stakes world of corporate mergers and acquisitions, the phrase due diligence is the ultimate, terrifying crucible. It is the agonizing period where the acquiring company sends in heavily armed teams of forensic auditors and ruthless corporate lawyers to microscopically examine every single piece of paper, every tax filing, and every property deed the seller claims to own. They are aggressively hunting for hidden liabilities. They are searching for the exact kind of dirty, unresolved legal messes that could potentially devalue their massive investment. Suddenly, the heavily engineered 50-page standard family release form sitting on my office desk made perfect, terrifying sense. Gregory was not giving me an early inheritance. He was desperately trying to legally sever me from the corporate structure before the international auditors dug deep enough to find whatever radioactive secret he had buried 15 years ago. If the acquiring hotel group found a lingering, messy dispute over the foundational assets of his empire, they would instantly kill the $500 million deal. He needed my legally binding signature to present a completely clean, undisputed chain of title to the buyers. The $32 million was simply the heavily inflated cost of my permanent, legally enforced blindness. He had strategically calculated that the sheer, overwhelming size of the number would instantly short-circuit my critical thinking. He assumed I would be far too busy celebrating my sudden fortune to ever ask what exactly I was selling. I slowly closed my laptop. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the kitchen. I felt a cold, deep clarity settle directly into my bones. For 15 years, he had held all the cards, aggressively dictating the exact terms of our existence. But right now, in this rapidly closing window of corporate due diligence, he was completely exposed. He was a man standing on a structurally compromised bridge, desperately trying to pay me to look away before the entire thing collapsed. I had no intention of looking away. I took the heavy leather folder directly to Kieran's house. The retired forensic accountant lived in a meticulously organized, dimly lit study that perpetually smelled of aged paper and strong espresso. He did not bother offering me pleasantries. He simply took the 50-page document from my hands, adjusted his thick reading glasses, and sat down at his massive wooden desk. We entirely ignored the $32 million buyout offer. Instead, Kieran focused his laser-sharp attention on the historical banking ledgers he had pulled from his encrypted archives. We needed to fundamentally understand the past before we could safely navigate the present. We need to thoroughly dissect the recurring deposits, Kieran stated, his finger tracing a long line of data on his monitor. $88,888. It is a highly specific, deliberately calculated figure. It is not an arbitrary allowance based on your living expenses. He cross-referenced the blinded corporate routing number that had been sending the money with a massive database of commercial tax filings. I watched as his eyes narrowed, catching a pattern that only someone with decades of auditing experience could possibly see. He was not giving you a gift, Athena, Kieran finally said, looking up from the screen. He was paying a mandatory commercial maintenance fee. I frowned, leaning closer to the desk. A maintenance fee for what? In complex commercial real estate, Kieran explained methodically. Developers rarely purchase the actual land outright. It is far too expensive and heavily taxed. Instead, they utilize something called a commercial ground lease. They rent the raw dirt for 99 years, and then they build their luxury hotels on top of it. But to keep that long-term lease legally active and avoid triggering aggressive audits from the Internal Revenue Service, the corporation must pay a highly specific, annually adjusted fee to the legal landowner. He turned the monitor toward me. The numbers on the screen perfectly aligned. The amount Gregory has been sending you every year matches the exact required commercial maintenance fee for a specific parcel of coastal land in Cape Cod, Kieran continued, his voice completely steady. If he missed a single payment, or if the amount was incorrect, the IRS algorithms would flag the corporate accounts for tax evasion. He disguised a legally mandated corporate expense as a benevolent birthday gift to his grieving niece. I felt a sudden, sharp coldness wash over me. The pure, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. He had not been supporting us. He had been quietly laundering his corporate obligations through my personal bank account. If he is paying a ground lease fee, I said slowly, connecting the logical dots, that means his corporation does not actually own the land under his flagship resorts. Kieran nodded grimly. Exactly. The revelation hung heavily in the quiet, dust-moted air of Kieran's study. I needed to fully comprehend the sheer scale of what we had just uncovered. Kieran swiftly opened a municipal zoning database, pulling up the highly detailed, color-coded property lines for the coastal area, where Gregory's most profitable, prestigious luxury resorts were currently operating. Look closely at the boundaries, Kieran instructed, using a silver pen to trace a long, narrow strip of land right on the digital map. The map clearly showed Gregory's massive, sprawling hotel complexes. But directly between those towering buildings and the actual ocean covering the main access roads, the private beaches, and the crucial utility lines was a distinct, red-outlined parcel of land. Gregory's holding company completely owns the physical buildings, Kieran explained, his tone clinical and precise. But this specific red strip, the absolute foundational bedrock that connects his resorts to the outside world, is heavily governed by a 99-year commercial ground lease. And who is the legal owner listed on that ground lease? I asked, though my rapidly beating heart already knew the inevitable answer. Kieran hit a few keys, bringing up the deeply buried, original title deed from over 2 decades ago. The name perfectly illuminated on the screen was not Gregory's. It was not the name of his corporate conglomerate. It was Bella's name. My mother. Your father did not leave her corporate shares when he died, Kieran said quietly. He was remarkably brilliant. He knew Gregory was a corporate predator. So, he left Bella the one thing Gregory could never forcefully dilute or aggressively vote away in a hostile boardroom meeting. He left her the actual dirt. The profound magnitude of Gregory's current panic finally made total, undeniable sense. Gregory was aggressively attempting to merge a $500 million empire with an international hotel group. But his entire empire was legally landlocked. The beautiful, towering hotels he claimed to own were completely dependent on a strip of land he did not control. The acquiring multinational corporation would never, under any circumstances, sign a final merger agreement if they discovered the flagship properties did not possess a clean, uncontested right to their own front doors. Gregory needed the $32 million family release form signed immediately to legally transfer Bella's ground lease to his corporation before the auditors discovered the massive, fatal discrepancy in the chain of title. If Bella legally owns the ground lease, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as the final, horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place. How has he been illegally controlling the property development for the last 15 years? Kieran slowly closed the digital file, looking at me with a profound, quiet sadness. Because 15 years ago, just days after your father's funeral, Gregory produced a document claiming your mother had signed over her complete legal proxy. He has been operating with a power of attorney. When a person finally realizes they have been fundamentally deceived for over a decade, the typical human reaction is explosive. You are supposed to feel a blinding rush of adrenaline. You are supposed to pick up the phone, dial the number of the person who betrayed you, and scream until your vocal cords are completely shredded. You demand answers. You demand immediate apologies. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I sat quietly in Kieran's dimly lit study, staring at the digital map of the coastal resort boundaries on his monitor. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion if it is not immediately converted into a calculated strategy. Screaming at Gregory would only give him the distinct advantage of knowing exactly how much I had uncovered. It would allow him to fortify his defenses. Instead of reaching for my phone, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a simple yellow legal pad and a pen. "We do not confront him," I said, my voice perfectly level. "If we confront him now, without the underlying documentation, he will simply bury us in aggressive corporate litigation until I am bankrupt. He has a team of incredibly expensive lawyers who specialize in intimidating civilians." Kieran leaned back in his leather chair, watching me with a silent, approving gaze. "So, what is the architectural blueprint for this demolition?" "We need the structural foundation," I replied, writing precisely on the pad. "Gregory is loudly claiming he has a legally binding power of attorney. He used that specific document to seamlessly bypass my mother and take absolute control of the ground lease 15 years ago. He used it to funnel the $88,000 maintenance fees through my personal accounts to avoid corporate audits." I underlined the words power of attorney twice. "A document like that does not simply exist in a vacuum," I continued, tracing the logical steps in my mind. "It has to be signed. It has to be notarized. And most importantly, it requires the conscious, willing consent of the person signing it." I looked up at Kieran. "My mother has Alzheimer's disease. The decline was gradual, but there were distinct, documented medical milestones. Gregory is a meticulous, ruthless businessman, but he is not a medical professional. If he forced her to sign that legal proxy while her cognitive functions were already compromised, the document is not a shield. It is a massive, fatal liability." I needed to find the exact timeline of Bella's medical diagnosis. I needed to meticulously compare the date of her clinical cognitive decline with the exact date Gregory had successfully filed the power of attorney. If the medical diagnosis predated his legal document by even a single day, his entire $500 million empire was resting on a provable act of fraud. I did not need to scream at my uncle. I just needed to patiently unearth the paperwork that would quietly destroy him. Kieran sat perfectly still, observing me for a long, heavy moment. The faint light from his computer monitor cast deep shadows across the lines of his weathered face. He had spent his entire career successfully navigating the murky, treacherous waters of corporate finance, watching greedy men like Gregory aggressively consume everything in their path. He let out a slow, quiet exhale. It sounded like the release of a breath he had been holding for over half a decade. Without saying a single word, Kieran slowly rolled his chair backward. He reached down to the lowest, heaviest oak drawer of his massive desk. I heard the sharp, metallic click of a complex lock disengaging. He pulled the drawer open, reached all the way to the back, and retrieved a small, unmarked manila envelope. He placed it deliberately on the desk between us. "Your mother was a brilliantly perceptive woman, Athena," Kieran said softly. "Even when the terrifying shadows of her illness began to aggressively close in on her, she understood exactly what Gregory was capable of." I stared at the envelope, my heart maintaining a steady, heavy rhythm. "What is this, Kieran?" "6 years ago," he began, his voice dipping into a reverent, quiet register. "It was a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The weather was terrible. Your mother suddenly arrived at my front door in a taxi. She had slipped away from her daily caregiver. She was visibly terrified, Athena, but she was not terrified of losing her memories. She was terrified of what Gregory would do to you once her memories were completely gone." He gently opened the flap of the envelope and slid a small, slightly rusted brass key onto the polished wood of his desk. It was attached to a faded, heavily worn numerical tag. "She handed me this key," Kieran continued, his eyes locked on mine. "She specifically instructed me to hide it securely. She made me swear, on my professional life, that I would not give it to you until you were definitively ready to stop hiding. She said you needed to be strong enough to look at the dirt." I reached out and picked up the cold, heavy brass key. The number 402 was deeply engraved into the metal. It was a standard safety deposit box key from a prominent, highly secure bank located in the financial district of downtown Boston. She knew Gregory was manipulating the legal framework, Kieran explained, gesturing to the key in my palm. In a moment of profound, desperate clarity, she meticulously gathered her own protective armor. She quietly secured the foundation before the fog of her disease completely overtook her mind. I closed my fingers tightly around the cold metal, feeling the jagged edges bite softly into my skin. For 15 years, I had believed Bella was simply a tragic, helpless victim of my uncle's overwhelming greed. I had profoundly underestimated her. She had not been passively waiting for the inevitable end. She had been quietly arming me for a war she knew I would eventually have to fight. "We are going to the bank," I said calmly. The high-security vault of the downtown Boston Bank was a masterclass in silent intimidation. It was a subterranean fortress composed entirely of polished steel, thick concrete, and heavily regulated, stale air. A quiet bank manager in a tailored suit efficiently escorted Kieran and me down the long, sterile corridor of metal boxes. He inserted his master key into box 402, and I slid Bella's rusted brass key into the second slot. With a heavy, satisfying click, the long metal drawer finally slid open. The manager discreetly retreated to give us privacy. I carefully lifted the heavy metal box and placed it on the private viewing table in the center of the room. My hands did not shake. I felt a profound, chilling sense of purpose. Inside the box lay 2 distinct items. The first was a thick, officially bound legal document. The heavy, textured paper was unmistakably old. I carefully flipped to the very first page. It was the original, fully executed commercial ground lease for the coastal property. It definitively proved that Bella, and only Bella, possessed the absolute right to the earth beneath Gregory's sprawling, $500 million luxury resort empire. But it was the second item that caused the air in the vault to feel suddenly incredibly thin. It was a sealed medical dossier from a highly prestigious, independent neurological institute in Massachusetts. I carefully broke the seal and opened the file. It contained a comprehensive, clinical cognitive assessment of my mother. I scanned the heavy medical terminology, my eyes immediately dropping to the official dates and the final clinical conclusion. The independent medical board had definitively declared Bella completely incapacitated and unfit to execute legally binding financial agreements. The date neatly stamped at the top of the official medical diagnosis was April 14th. Kieran leaned over my shoulder, silently comparing the date on the medical dossier with his own detailed financial notes regarding Gregory's corporate filings. Gregory formally filed his power of attorney, giving him absolute control over the ground lease on August 22nd of that exact same year, Kieran stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. I stared at the 2 dates, April and August, 4 distinct, undeniable months apart. Gregory had not simply pressured a grieving widow. He had actively, maliciously, dragged a medically incapacitated woman to a notary, public 4 months after an independent medical board had officially declared her cognitively void. He had essentially forced a ghost to sign away a multi-million-dollar coastal empire. This was no longer just a messy family dispute over an inheritance. This was not a simple disagreement over a $32 million buyout. This was a highly documented, undeniable act of profound corporate fraud. It was a massive, radioactive legal liability that would instantly terrify any international hotel group attempting a corporate merger. I carefully placed the medical dossier and the ground lease back into my leather tote bag. The truth was no longer buried in the past. It was sitting securely right in my hands. "We have the foundation," I told Kieran quietly. "Now, we bring in the demolition crew." The universe has a strange way of alerting predators when their prey finally stops running. I did not contact Gregory. I did not respond to his buyout offer. Yet, somehow, the profound silence radiating from my end must have triggered a massive alarm in his meticulously controlled world. The retaliation began precisely at 9 a.m. the following Monday. I was sitting in my studio, quietly reviewing the medical dossier, when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my cousin Monica's name. Monica was Gregory's oldest daughter. She was a woman who had lived her entirely privileged life firmly under her father's dictatorial thumb, trading her independence for a prominent executive title in his corporate empire. I answered the call, my tone neutral. "Hello, Monica?" "Athena, what on earth are you doing?" Monica's voice was high-pitched, heavily saturated with perfectly practiced, frantic anxiety. "Dad is practically making himself sick with worry. He offered you $32 million. That is a fortune." "Athena, why haven't you signed the release papers?" "I am currently reviewing the structural integrity of the agreement." "Monica," I replied smoothly. "You are destroying the family." She suddenly snapped, the manufactured concern instantly vanishing, replaced by aggressive, emotional manipulation. "Dad has sacrificed everything to keep this empire afloat after your father died. He has protected you. And now, right when he is trying to secure the family legacy with this merger, you are acting completely greedy and unstable. Just sign the papers. Athena, do not ruin this for all of us." "I appreciate your deep concern for the corporate merger, Monica," I said, utterly unmoved by her dramatic performance. "I will handle my own financial affairs. Goodbye." I ended the call. Not even 10 minutes later, the real punishment arrived. My studio landline rang. It was the director of a major municipal park project, one of my firm's largest, most prestigious ecological design contracts for the upcoming year. The director sounded deeply uncomfortable. He awkwardly explained that the city board had suddenly decided to go in a different creative direction. The contract was abruptly canceled, effective immediately. An hour later, a private estate client called to permanently suspend my landscape services, citing vague, unspecified budget concerns. Gregory was methodically suffocating my professional oxygen. He was silently flexing his massive network of influence, demonstrating how easily he could dismantle the independent life I had spent 15 years building. He wanted me panicked. He wanted me desperately crawling back to his mahogany desk, begging for the $32 million just to survive. If your family has ever used money to aggressively suffocate your boundaries, you know exactly how the heavy, suffocating air in my office felt that morning. Let me know in the comments if you've survived this kind of profound pressure. I looked at the canceled contracts on my desk. I did not shed a single tear. A weak man uses loud threats and economic sabotage to force compliance. A strong man simply waits for the ink to dry. Gregory was panicking. I calmly picked up my phone and dialed the number of the most ruthless estate litigator in Boston. Marlene did not have a cozy, welcoming office. She operated out of a sleek, high-rise glass fortress in the financial district. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, discerning eyes, and a reputation for completely dismantling arrogant corporate executives in court. I did not hire her for her warmth. I hired her for her absolute, surgical precision. I sat across from her massive desk and silently slid the original ground lease and Bella's clinical medical dossier toward her. Marlene adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses and began to read. She did not interrupt me with sympathetic gasps. She simply absorbed the data. When she reached the discrepancy between the April medical diagnosis and the August power of attorney, a very slow, cold smile spread across her face. "Your uncle is an incredibly foolish man," Marlene stated, tapping the medical file. "He is offering $32 million for a quick signature to finalize his merger. I explained quietly. He believes his power of attorney is an impenetrable legal shield. Marlene leaned forward, and this is where the absolute power of the legal process becomes deeply beautiful. There is a fundamental concept in estate law regarding the illusion of consent, Marlene explained, her voice sharp and authoritative. A notarized power of attorney looks incredibly intimidating to a civilian. It bears official stamps and heavy legal jargon. But the entire foundation of that document relies on the signatory possessing the mental capacity to fully understand what they are surrendering. She pointed directly at the independent medical board's conclusion. This is not a subjective opinion. Athena, this is a definitive, clinical guillotine. The moment a recognized medical board officially declares a patient incapacitated, they lose the legal ability to consent. Because this diagnosis occurred 4 months before Gregory procured her signature. The power of attorney is completely void ab initio. It means it was legally dead the moment the ink touched the paper. I listened, feeling a profound sense of intellectual satisfaction wash over me. This means, Marlene continued, her eyes locking onto mine, that every single corporate decision, every zoning permit, and every financial transaction Gregory has executed on that specific coastal land over the past 15 years was done without lawful authorization. He has been aggressively building a luxury empire on a foundation of absolute fraud. Gregory had spent over a decade carefully gaslighting me into believing he was the untouchable architect of our reality. He had utilized his wealth to project an aura of absolute invincibility. But wealth does not rewrite the strict, unforgiving timeline of clinical medical records. He needs my signature on the family release form to permanently erase this discrepancy before the multinational hotel group audits the chain of title. I said, completely understanding the terrifying leverage I now held. Exactly, Marlene confirmed. If the acquiring corporate entity discovers that the flagship resorts are sitting on heavily disputed, fraudulently acquired land, they will immediately abandon the $500 million merger to avoid the radioactive liability. I nodded slowly, the master plan fully forming in my mind. Then we make absolutely sure they discover it. We did not answer Monica's frantic, manipulative phone calls. We did not attempt to desperately salvage the prestigious municipal park contract that Gregory had so ruthlessly torpedoed just to prove his overwhelming power. When you are quietly preparing to completely demolish a corrupt, $500 million empire, you do not waste your precious mental energy mourning the temporary loss of a single landscaping project. I simply turned off my phone, locked the heavy wooden front door of my design studio, and handed the entire narrative over to Marlene. For 3 consecutive days, my quiet, earth-scented office transformed into a highly classified legal war room. Kieran sat quietly in the corner, his reading glasses perched on his nose, meticulously cross-referencing Gregory's public corporate filings with the private, deeply hidden banking routing numbers. Marlene dominated my large drafting table, completely covering my intricate ecological blueprints with stark, unforgiving legal precedents and corporate statutes. We were not drafting a simple, polite cease and desist letter. A warning letter is merely a suggestion, and Gregory would have simply handed it to his expensive corporate fixers to casually bury under a mountain of aggressive litigation. We were drafting a nuclear weapon in the highly sensitive world of commercial real estate. We were filing an emergency, legally binding injunction. An injunction is a powerful, uncompromising court order that instantly halts a specific action. We were intentionally directing this extremely aggressive document not at Gregory himself, but directly at the highly insulated escrow bank facilitating the massive multinational merger. We were legally notifying the financial institution holding the $500 million that the foundational asset, the ground lease securing the flagship coastal resorts, was currently the subject of an active, severe fraud investigation involving an incapacitated senior citizen. Once this injunction hits the escrow bank's legal compliance desk, Marlene explained, her pen sharply circling a critical paragraph, it acts as an unbreakable, absolute financial freeze. The bank cannot legally transfer a single dollar to Gregory's holding company without making themselves completely, criminally liable for facilitating a fraudulent corporate transaction. I watched the heavy laser printer meticulously churn out page after page of the final, devastating document. There was absolutely no anger left in my body. The white-hot, blinding rage I had briefly felt when I first realized the depth of his betrayal had completely cooled, hardening into a solid, impenetrable sheet of ice. Gregory had spent 15 years treating my mother and me like fragile, insignificant numbers on a deeply buried spreadsheet. He had arrogantly assumed that throwing $32 million at the problem would permanently erase his original, unforgivable sin. He did not understand that the very legal system he had ruthlessly weaponized against a sick widow could be flawlessly turned back against him. Marlene meticulously stamped the final pages, gathering the injunction alongside the heavily protected, certified copies of Bella's clinical medical diagnosis and the original ground lease. She placed the entire stack into a thick, unmarked manila envelope. "The legal trigger is set," Marlene said quietly, looking at me with a steady, fierce intelligence. "The escrow bank receives this exact package at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, just as the final signing ceremony officially begins." I nodded slowly, feeling the immense, silent weight of the impending collision. The morning of the final corporate merger arrived with a crisp, intensely bright coastal sunrise. In the penthouse suite of his luxury residence, Gregory was likely adjusting his expensive silk tie, admiring his reflection, and silently congratulating himself. In his arrogant, fiercely insulated reality, my total silence over the past 3 days meant absolute, pathetic submission. He genuinely believed that the $32 million sitting untouched in my account had successfully paralyzed me with greed or fear. He thought the swift, brutal cancellation of my municipal contracts had firmly reminded me of my incredibly fragile place in his world. He was heading to the downtown corporate headquarters completely convinced that he was about to cement his massive legacy and permanently cash out an empire built entirely on stolen earth. I stood in my own quiet hallway, carefully adjusting the collar of my simple, perfectly pressed gray suit. I did not wear expensive jewelry. I did not want to project superficial wealth. I wanted to project undeniable, unshakable permanence. Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table, happily eating her oatmeal and drawing a detailed picture of a coastal heron. I walked over, leaned down, and gently kissed the top of her head. She smelled of warm milk and pure childhood innocence, entirely shielded from the massive, incredibly dark corporate war I was about to wage on behalf of her grandmother. "Have a wonderful day at school, sweetie," I told her, my voice incredibly soft and remarkably steady. "Good luck with your big meeting, Mom." She smiled brightly, completely unaware of the terrifying magnitude of the day. I picked up my structured leather briefcase from the counter. It was not physically heavy, but it contained the entire gravitational weight of my family's actual truth. Inside lay the certified medical diagnosis from the Neuro Institute, the original ground lease, and the receipt of the explosive injunction we had just legally fired at the escrow bank. Kieran was already waiting outside in his unassuming, incredibly ordinary sedan. Marlene was set to meet us directly in the lobby of the massive, glass-fronted skyscraper in the financial district. The drive into downtown Boston was eerily quiet. I watched the towering, modern skyline slowly approach, instantly recognizing the specific, glittering high-rise where Gregory's holding company occupied the top 3 opulent floors. "Are your hands shaking?" Kieran asked quietly, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the morning traffic. I looked down at my hands resting calmly on the leather briefcase in my lap. They were perfectly, absolutely still. "No," I replied truthfully. When you are finally walking into a room to tell the absolute truth after 15 years of meticulously maintained lies, there is no room left for fear. Fear is a highly volatile emotion strictly reserved for those who have something desperate and fragile to hide. Gregory was the one operating a massive, highly flammable illusion. I was simply the one carrying the matches. We pulled up to the towering glass building just before 9. The air was cold, the sky was a piercing blue, and the final, devastating hour of Gregory's unchallenged reign had officially begun. I stepped out of the car, gripping the briefcase, and did not look back. The corporate boardroom of Gregory's holding company was a spectacular, highly engineered monument to intimidation. It was situated on the 50th floor, entirely encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dominating, sweeping view of the Boston Harbor and the distant, fragile coastline he loved to aggressively exploit. Marlene, Kieran, and I stepped out of the private executive elevator. The receptionist, a sharply dressed young woman in a designer suit, instantly stood up, her eyes widening in profound confusion. I was obviously not on the highly restricted, heavily guarded guest list for the $500 million merger ceremony. "Excuse me, ma'am, you absolutely cannot go in there," she stammered, frantically reaching for her sleek desk phone to alert the internal security team. We did not pause. We did not offer polite, unnecessary explanations. We moved with the synchronized, undeniable authority of people who legally owned the literal ground beneath their feet. I reached the massive, heavy oak doors of the main boardroom, grasped the brass handles, and firmly pushed them open. The room was filled with a dozen high-powered executives, prominent international attorneys, and luxury hospitality representatives. At the very head of the long, brilliantly polished mahogany table stood Gregory. He was literally holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. A triumphant, arrogant smile plastered across his face as he prepared to toast the final, historic signing of the merger documents. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind us, the entire room fell into a sudden, violently awkward silence. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that instantly sucks all the breathable oxygen out of the space, leaving everyone temporarily paralyzed. Gregory's triumphant, gleaming smile instantly froze. His eyes locked onto me, then shifted nervously to the formidable, unmistakable presence of Marlene, and finally settled on Kieran, the living ghost of his past financial sins. I watched the exact moment his arrogant, unshakable confidence violently collided with a sudden, icy wall of pure terror. He knew immediately that my presence here, flanked by a fierce corporate litigator and a forensic accountant, was not to offer him a tearful, grateful embrace. If you have ever been the designated scapegoat of a deeply toxic family, if you have ever been violently told to just stay quiet and accept the pathetic crumbs they throw at you, would you have the unwavering courage to walk into their most triumphant moment and tear down the illusion? Let me know in the comments if this deeply resonates with you. CTA 3, Giua 2. Athena. Gregory finally spoke, his voice unusually tight, desperately attempting to project calm authority in front of his wealthy international buyers. "This is a closed, highly sensitive corporate meeting. You need to leave immediately. We can discuss your personal family matters later." He gave a sharp, incredibly subtle nod to two large security men standing near the back wall. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, letting the incredibly tense silence stretch out, allowing the prominent international buyers to clearly see the sudden, inexplicable panic radiating from their supposed business partner. "We are not here to discuss personal family matters, Gregory," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the expansive room. "We are here to thoroughly discuss the foundational legal boundaries of this specific corporate transaction." Gregory's face flushed a deep, highly dangerous shade of crimson. He forcefully set his champagne flute down on the table, the sharp, fragile clink echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. He was desperately trying to manage the rapidly deteriorating narrative, calculating how to seamlessly dismiss me as a hysterical, unstable relative before the international buyers started asking fatal, probing questions. Gentlemen, I deeply apologize for this highly unprofessional interruption. Gregory addressed the confused executives from the acquiring hotel group, his tone dripping with manufactured, patronizing sympathy. My niece has been going through a remarkably difficult, unstable emotional period. I will have security escort her out so we can finalize the agreements. The two large security guards took a heavy, intimidating step forward. Marlene smoothly stepped directly in front of me, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying legal menace. She did not raise her voice. She did not shout. She simply reached into her leather briefcase, extracted a thick, officially stamped document, and slid it firmly down the center of the polished mahogany table. It stopped precisely in front of the lead counsel for the International Hotel Group. If your security personnel lay a single hand on my client, I will add a massive, highly public civil suit to the federal fraud charges currently being filed, Marlene stated, her voice as cold, sharp, and precise as a surgical scalpel. Gregory froze completely, his eyes darting frantically to the heavy document resting on the table. The aggressive posture he had been projecting instantly evaporated. "What is this absolute nonsense?" he demanded, though his voice notably lacked its usual booming, intimidating resonance. "That is an emergency, legally binding injunction," Marlene informed the room, completely ignoring Gregory and speaking directly to the acquiring corporate attorneys. "It was successfully filed and fully activated at 9 o'clock this morning with your primary escrow bank. It completely freezes all financial transfers related to this specific merger." The lead counsel for the buyers, a sharp-eyed man in a dark, expensive suit, immediately picked up the document, his brow deeply furrowed as he rapidly scanned the dense, unforgiving legal text. I stepped forward, looking directly into Gregory's terrified, rapidly widening eyes. I did not look at him with hatred. I looked at him with the calm, devastating pity one reserves for a remarkably foolish child who has finally been caught playing with dangerous matches. "You are attempting to sell a $500 million coastal empire, Gregory," I said quietly, the absolute, chilling certainty in my voice completely dominating the room. "But you deliberately failed to inform your generous international partners about one minor, microscopic detail." I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable weight of the moment fully settle over the executives. "You do not actually own the land your flagship hotels are standing on," I declared. "You are attempting to legally sell magnificent buildings built on Earth that completely belongs to my mother. And you aggressively, criminally stole her consent to do it." The reaction within the glass boardroom was immediate and deeply chaotic. The lead counsel for the International Hotel Group abruptly pushed his leather chair back, his face completely drained of color, as he finished reading the first critical page of the injunction. He rapidly handed the document to his team of corporate auditors, who instantly began frantically whispering to each other, their eyes darting suspiciously toward Gregory. In the ruthless, high-stakes world of corporate acquisitions, vague uncertainty is highly toxic, but actual documented title fraud is an absolute, immediate death sentence. "This is an outrageous, completely fabricated lie," Gregory suddenly shouted, completely losing his carefully curated, aristocratic composure. His face was contorted in genuine, unfiltered panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "She is a deeply ungrateful, greedy child. I have financially supported her pathetic family for 15 years. I offered her $32 million just days ago out of the pure goodness of my heart." He was violently, spectacularly self-destructing. Every loud, desperate word he screamed only further validated the precise accusations heavily outlined in our injunction. I remained perfectly still, a silent, immovable anchor in the center of the rapidly escalating storm. I did not raise my voice to eagerly defend myself against his frantic insults. I did not need to scream to prove I was right. The $88,000 you meticulously transferred to my account every single year was not a generous, loving gift. Gregory, I replied, my voice slicing effortlessly through his aggressive shouting. It was the exact, legally mandated commercial maintenance fee for the 99-year ground lease. A vital lease you aggressively manipulated my deeply ill mother into surrendering. The international executives were now openly, fiercely glaring at Gregory. The lead counsel forcefully held up a hand, instantly silencing Gregory's frantic, embarrassing protests. "Mr. Donovan," the lead attorney said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous corporate warmth. "Is there any factual validity to this specific claim? Does your holding company possess an entirely clean, undisputed legal title to the coastal acreage beneath the primary resort properties?" Gregory stammered, a cold, undeniable sweat clearly visible on his forehead. I have a fully notarized power of attorney. It is completely legal. She is just aggressively trying to extort more money from me at the 11th hour." He was desperately, pathetically clinging to his fragile paper shield. He genuinely believed that because he had successfully bullied a sick woman into signing a document 15 years ago, the formidable legal system would automatically protect him today. He was about to intensely learn a brutal, unforgiving lesson regarding the strict, undeniable timeline of clinical medicine. I calmly unclasped my structured leather briefcase. I pulled out the sealed, heavily certified medical dossier we had retrieved from the vault. I placed it gently, deliberately on the table. The sharp sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood felt remarkably like the final, devastating drop of a guillotine. Gregory stared down at the heavy medical dossier resting on the polished mahogany table. He did not attempt to open it. He did not need to read the clinical terminology to deeply understand that his carefully constructed, 15-year illusion had just violently shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The aggressive, bullying tactic had completely failed. The international executives were currently looking at him not as a brilliant visionary, but as a massive, radioactive legal liability. So, like any true desperate predator realizing that brute force is no longer effective, he instantly changed his strategy. He pivoted to emotional manipulation, his rigid posture noticeably softened. He let out a long, heavy sigh, expertly dropping his shoulders to project a sudden aura of deep, profound exhaustion. He looked directly at me, his eyes suddenly welling with manufactured, highly practiced tears. "Athena, please," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a gentle, pleading whisper that echoed loudly in the silent room. "I know you are deeply angry. I know the past 15 years have been incredibly difficult for you and Bella. But you have to try to understand my position. I took over this massive burden to protect this family. Your father poured his entire soul into this company. He would want us to stand together. We are family, Athena. You cannot destroy our shared legacy like this." I stood perfectly still, listening to the familiar, toxic melody of his guilt trip. For the vast majority of my life, that exact word family had been aggressively used as a heavy, unyielding weapon against me. It was a deeply manipulative label specifically designed to force absolute compliance. Toxic individuals relentlessly use the concept of blood relation to seamlessly demand the kind of blind loyalty they have absolutely never earned. They genuinely believe that sharing a biological lineage gives them a permanent, irrevocable right to continuously sacrifice your well-being for their own personal comfort. But as I looked at Gregory, standing there desperately invoking my late father's name to protect his stolen corporate empire, I felt absolutely nothing. The heavy, invisible chain that had quietly bound me to this man for 15 years dissolved completely. I glanced briefly to my left. Kieran was standing firmly by my side, a man who had kept a rusted brass key hidden in the dark for 6 years just to protect me. I looked to my right. Marlene was standing tall, a brilliant legal shield who had worked tirelessly for 3 days straight to build an impenetrable fortress around my mother's rights. They were my true allies. They were the people who actually protected me when I was vulnerable. Blood simply dictates how you arrive in this world. It absolutely does not dictate who you are obligated to suffer for. I looked back at Gregory. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear of misplaced guilt. "You fundamentally misunderstand the situation," I said, my voice perfectly calm, ringing with an undeniable, quiet dignity. "A family protects its weakest members. It does not deliberately manipulate a sick woman's declining memory to steal the ground beneath her feet." Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but I smoothly cut him off. "You were never family, Gregory," I stated, delivering the final, devastating truth with absolute precision. "You were just a terrible, incompetent gatekeeper." My words hung suspended in the heavy, overly conditioned air of the corporate boardroom. I had entirely stripped away his final, desperate line of defense. There was no more manufactured familial warmth to hide behind. There was only the stark, incredibly cold reality of the heavily documented fraud sitting plainly on the table. The profound silence was abruptly broken by the sharp, decisive sound of a leather portfolio snapping completely shut. The lead counsel for the International Hotel Group stood up. His face was entirely devoid of any residual corporate politeness. In the highly unforgiving realm of international mergers and acquisitions, capital is inherently cowardly. It flees at the very first definitive sign of severe legal instability. And Gregory had just been publicly exposed as a man actively attempting to sell a $500 million resort empire built directly on top of a completely fraudulent ground lease. "Mr. Donovan," the lead counsel said, his tone as cold and hard as the glass walls surrounding us. "My firm operates under exceptionally strict compliance regulations. We cannot, under any circumstances, proceed with the due diligence phase of this acquisition while there is an active, heavily documented dispute regarding the foundational title of the primary real estate assets." Gregory's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. He reached out a trembling hand toward the executives. "Wait, please. This is just a minor, easily resolvable internal misunderstanding. I assure you, my legal team will have this completely cleared up by the end of the week. Do not walk away from this historic merger over a hysterical family dispute." The international executives completely ignored him. They were already moving efficiently toward the heavy oak doors, buttoning their expensive suit jackets and quietly murmuring to their respective legal aides. "We are officially withdrawing our letter of intent, effective immediately," the lead counsel stated firmly, not even bothering to look back at Gregory. "Furthermore, as per the binding stipulations of the injunction filed this morning, the escrow bank has officially frozen all related transactional accounts. This merger is dead." The heavy boardroom doors swung open, and the entire team of wealthy, powerful buyers seamlessly exited the room, taking their $500 million with them. The sheer magnitude of the sudden financial collapse was breathtaking to witness. Gregory stood completely frozen at the head of the polished mahogany table. His face was pale and slick with cold sweat. The incredibly shiny, towering empire he had ruthlessly spent 15 years building through manipulation and theft had just completely evaporated in less than 10 minutes. He looked down at the empty crystal champagne flute still resting near his hand. He had been mere moments away from permanently securing a massive, international legacy. Now, he was entirely landlocked, publicly humiliated, and facing an impending wave of disastrous financial investigations. Marlene calmly reached out and retrieved the injunction from the table, sliding it effortlessly back into her leather briefcase. The surgical strike had been executed with absolute, terrifying perfection. "I believe we are entirely finished here," Marlene stated smoothly, adjusting her glasses. We turned to leave, but the dying predator had one final, desperate gasp left in his lungs. Nobody is leaving this room." The voice did not belong to Gregory. It belonged to his personal corporate attorney, a slick, sharply dressed man named Sterling, who had been standing silently in the corner shadows of the boardroom. As the international buyers fully retreated down the hallway, Sterling slowly stepped forward, a deeply arrogant, highly confident smirk suddenly appearing on his face. Gregory looked at his lawyer with a sudden, desperate flash of hope. Sterling confidently reached into his heavily branded leather briefcase and extracted a crisp, immaculate legal folder. He tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Marlene. "You played a very impressive game of historical archaeology today. Ladies," Sterling said, his tone dripping with profound, condescending arrogance. "You managed to dig up an incredibly old, heavily outdated medical file and a deeply buried ground lease. It makes for a wonderful, dramatic narrative." He tapped the crisp new folder with his index finger. "However, the law strictly prioritizes the most recent, explicitly executed documents. What you are currently looking at is a fully updated, legally binding, and notarized transfer of ground lease." Sterling smiled, his teeth gleaming under the harsh boardroom lights. "It officially signs over absolute, permanent control of the coastal land directly to Mr. Donovan's holding company." He paused, letting the devastating implication hang in the air. "And it was personally signed and explicitly authorized by Bella herself at the assisted living facility exactly 8 months ago." Gregory let out a sharp, incredibly loud gasp of relief. The color instantly rushed back into his face. He actually laughed a harsh, triumphant, deeply ugly sound. He genuinely believed his highly paid lawyer had just successfully produced a magical, impenetrable shield. He thought he had just won the war. I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I did not break my steady, perfectly calm posture. I had meticulously spent 15 years watching this man aggressively manipulate paperwork. I had entirely expected him to attempt one final, desperate forgery. I looked slowly at Marlene. She did not even bother to open the new folder. She simply offered a cold, predatory smile. I turned my gaze back to the deeply arrogant lawyer. "Sterling," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet commanding the absolute attention of the room. "Did you personally oversee the execution of that specific document 8 months ago?" "I did," Sterling confirmed proudly. "Signed, witnessed, and fully notarized." "Then you have just severely compromised your own legal license," I stated quietly. I reached back into my bag and tapped the heavy medical dossier we had retrieved from the vault. "Marlene," I said calmly, "please remind opposing counsel of the precise date on the Independent Neurological Board's clinical conclusion." Marlene smoothly opened the file. "The Independent Medical Board officially, clinically declared Bella completely, irrevocably incapacitated and unfit to sign any legal document 6 entire years ago." I watched the arrogant smirk instantly, violently vanish from Sterling's face. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him the color of old ash. "You just proudly admitted, on the record, to actively conspiring to force a patient with documented, advanced-stage Alzheimer's disease to sign a complex transfer of commercial real estate." I explained, my tone perfectly even and utterly merciless. "That is not a brilliant legal maneuver, Sterling. That is a highly prosecutable, severely punishable felony." Sterling stumbled backward, literally dropping his pen onto the carpet. He looked at Gregory with absolute horror, realizing his incredibly wealthy client had just dragged him directly into a massive criminal conspiracy. The false counterattack had not simply failed. It had beautifully, flawlessly handed us the exact weapon needed to destroy them both. I turned around, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me as we walked out into the bright Boston morning. I didn't look back. The collapse of Gregory's empire did not happen with a loud, theatrical explosion. It happened with a series of incredibly quiet, highly devastating legal clicks. By noon, that exact same day, the multinational hotel group had officially filed their formal withdrawal with the Securities and Exchange Commission. They firmly cited irreconcilable legal discrepancies in the primary asset title. In the ruthless, hyper-connected world of high finance, a public withdrawal of that magnitude is essentially a distress flare. It violently signals to every other major investor that the core foundation of the company is profoundly compromised. The severe financial bleeding began almost immediately. Gregory's privately held corporate stock plummeted. The escrow bank, firmly bound by Marlene's meticulously drafted injunction, completely froze all of his holding company's primary transitional accounts. He was a man dying of extreme financial thirst while sitting directly next to a frozen lake. But the most severe damage was not strictly financial. The SEC swiftly launched a comprehensive federal inquiry into his initial merger disclosures, specifically targeting his fraudulent use of a medically invalid power of attorney. He had aggressively tried to pass off stolen earth as legitimate corporate collateral. The federal government does not politely ignore structural fraud. 2 weeks later, the heavily insulated walls of his personal life also began to inevitably crack. I read in the morning paper that his wife of 30 years had formally filed for a highly contested divorce. She was strategically aiming to rapidly secure her own private assets before the federal investigators could completely seize the family estate. She did not stand by him. When an empire is built entirely on superficial leverage and intimidation, loyalty vanishes the exact second the power heavily shifts. The most surprising casualty of the fallout, however, was Monica. My cousin showed up at my design studio late one rainy afternoon. She did not wear her usual designer corporate attire. She looked incredibly tired, her posture entirely defeated. She did not scream at me this time. She stood silently in the doorway, looking at the intricate ecological blueprints on my wall. I genuinely didn't know. Athena, Monica said, her voice barely a hollow whisper. I thought he was just being difficult about money. I never imagined he actually forged. I never knew he actively stole from Aunt Bella. I looked at her. I saw a woman who had just terrifyingly realized that her entire privileged existence was meticulously funded by the quiet, systematic abuse of a sick relative. Ignorance is a very comfortable luxury, Monica, I replied calmly. But it is no longer an available excuse. She nodded slowly, deeply absorbing the absolute finality of my words. She had officially resigned from his board of directors that morning. She was finally walking away. When you finally hold the absolute legal right to the physical ground beneath a massive commercial enterprise, you don't need to ever raise your voice to powerfully dictate the future. You simply dictate the uncompromising terms of the new structural reality. I did not want to entirely destroy the coastal resorts. Vengeance that solely focuses on mindless destruction is a remarkably shallow, unfulfilling victory. I am a landscape architect. My fundamental professional purpose is to thoughtfully build, to effectively restore, and to carefully heal deeply damaged environments. I used my absolute leverage over the ground lease to force a massive, unprecedented corporate restructuring. Gregory was permanently expelled from his own executive board as a mandatory, non-negotiable condition of the new legal settlement. The remaining corporate directors, desperately terrified of losing the physical ground holding their expensive buildings, agreed to my exact, meticulous terms. They signed a heavily revised, tightly monitored lease agreement that paid the actual, immense market value of the coastal property directly into a transparent trust. But the financial settlement was merely the secondary victory. The primary victory involved the earth itself. I legally forced the conglomerate to completely surrender a massive, highly sensitive stretch of the coastal wetlands they had previously earmarked for aggressive, destructive concrete expansion. I officially severed that specific parcel from their commercial zoning permits. I took that fragile, beautiful stretch of Atlantic shoreline and legally transformed it into a heavily protected, permanent conservation trust. I proudly named it the Bella Ecological Preserve. I spent the next 18 months physically working the soil. I did not sit in a sterile corporate office counting my massive settlement. I put on heavy boots and thick work gloves. I worked alongside a dedicated team of environmental scientists to carefully remove the toxic runoff pipes Gregory's company had secretly installed. We meticulously replanted thousands of native seagrass plugs. We effectively rebuilt the natural, protective dunes that the greedy developers had previously bulldozed. Every single time I buried my hands deep into the cold, wet coastal earth, I felt another heavy link of Gregory's invisible, 15-year chain completely shatter. I was actively reversing his toxic legacy. I was transforming a hidden site of profound corporate theft into a thriving, untouchable sanctuary of natural preservation. The incredibly deep, enduring satisfaction of that grueling physical work completely dwarfed the momentary thrill I had felt in that downtown glass boardroom. Publicly exposing a cruel man is certainly a necessary, powerful step toward achieving justice. But actively using the very resources he aggressively stole to permanently heal the damage he caused, that is the ultimate, undeniable manifestation of true power. Gregory had spent his entire life obsessively trying to completely pave over the truth. The roots were breathing again. True, sustainable wealth is profoundly, wonderfully boring. It absolutely does not look like highly secretive $88,000 wire transfers silently arriving in the middle of the night. It does not carry the heavy, suffocating anxiety of hidden corporate agendas or the terrifying threat of sudden, absolute ruin. With Kieran's meticulous, brilliant financial guidance, I established a heavily fortified, deeply transparent educational trust for my daughter, Ellie. There were absolutely no hidden clauses. There were no manipulative strings meticulously attached to her future. She would never have to quietly wonder where her security came from, and she would never have to owe her blind compliance to a toxic relative to strictly maintain it. Her foundation was legally, structurally, and morally bulletproof. The massive financial pressure that had secretly shadowed my entire adult life was finally completely gone. The profound relief did not manifest as a wild, euphoric celebration. It manifested as a deep, incredibly steady quietness in my daily routine. On a remarkably bright, crisp Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the assisted living facility. The coastal air sweeping off the Atlantic felt incredibly clean and totally unburdened. I walked into Bella's room. She was sitting in her usual floral armchair, peacefully watching the gentle movement of the ocean. Her Alzheimer's disease had inevitably continued its slow, quiet progression, heavily blurring the sharp, brilliant edges of her once formidable mind. She did not fully comprehend the massive, complex legal war we had just decisively won in her name. She did not know about the devastating corporate injunction, the terrified international buyers, or Gregory's highly publicized, embarrassing downfall. But she did not need to understand the dark corporate mechanics. She only needed to feel the absolute safety of the result. I pulled up a chair beside her and gently opened a large, glossy portfolio I had brought with me. It was a series of high-resolution photographs of the newly established Bella Ecological Preserve. The images vividly showed the thriving, bright green seagrass, the beautifully restored natural dunes, and the clear, unpolluted water returning to the previously damaged shoreline. I slowly placed the photographs gently on her lap. Bella looked down at the vibrant images. Her delicate, thin fingers softly traced the outline of the native coastal plants. For a long, suspended moment, the heavy fog in her eyes seemed to slightly part. A small, deeply peaceful smile touched the corners of her mouth. "The ground is breathing," she whispered softly, her voice carrying a profound, quiet contentment. "Yes, Bella," I replied, gently taking her hand in mine. The ground is finally breathing, and it is completely yours." She did not say anything else. She simply continued to look at the beautiful, healing earth, completely safe, entirely protected, and forever separated from the ruthless greed that had once desperately tried to consume her. The silence was finally safe. 2 full years have officially passed since I calmly walked out of that silent, terrified corporate boardroom. I am currently standing on the quiet edge of the Bella Ecological Preserve, feeling the strong, incredibly cold Atlantic wind actively pulling at my hair. In the distance, carefully restricted by the strict, newly forged legal boundaries of our ground lease, Gregory's massive luxury hotels still stand against the gray skyline, but they no longer resemble imposing, untouchable monuments to his absolute power. Under new, heavily monitored corporate management, they simply look like ordinary, incredibly expensive glass boxes permanently trapped on a piece of earth they will never truly own. Gregory himself has completely faded into an irrelevant, highly litigious obscurity. He is currently drowning in endless federal fines and incredibly messy divorce proceedings. The towering, terrifying shadow he once aggressively cast over my entire life has completely, permanently dissolved into absolutely nothing. I look down at my boots, firmly planted in the rich, dark coastal soil that I helped to physically restore. I think heavily about the 15 years of my life perfectly defined by those bizarre, unexplained birthday transfers. I think about how incredibly easy it would have been to simply take that $32 million, close my eyes, and comfortably walk away into a wealthy, cowardly silence. I realize now that the most dangerous traps in this world are almost never constructed with visible iron bars. They are meticulously built with heavy, unearned guilt, weaponized family loyalty, and the profoundly quiet, daily normalization of outright emotional abuse. We are often rigidly taught that cutting off a family member is a profound moral failure. We are aggressively conditioned to absorb their toxic behavior simply because we share a biological lineage. But I have learned, through the harsh crucible of corporate litigation and ecological restoration, that true preservation sometimes requires a completely ruthless pruning. You cannot possibly heal a diseased environment while the primary toxin is still actively pumping poison into the roots. The absolute truth is always resting patiently just beneath the shiny, artificial surface, waiting strictly for someone brave enough to finally start digging. You simply have to be willing to look at the dirt. Legacy isn't the towering, expensive concrete you passively inherit. It is the fundamental truth you aggressively protect and the essential ground you absolutely refuse to give up. What would you have done if a multi-million-dollar fortune suddenly landed in your lap, wrapped tightly in a 50-page contract of absolute silence? Would you have taken the remarkably comfortable buyout? Or would you have risked your entire livelihood to ruthlessly uncover what that money was desperately trying to hide? If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to strategically cut ties with toxic blood to permanently protect your own peace, please share this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening. Always protect your own ground.